The dense jungle of Nix 7 pulsed with an eerie bioluminescent glow. Towering trees twisted toward the sky, their elongated branches dripping with iridescent vines that shimmered like liquid silver in the dim atmosphere. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the faint hum of unseen creatures and the occasional flicker of something moving just beyond sight. This planet was alive in ways Kieran Rowe had never encountered before, both mesmerizing and unsettling. His boots crunched against the moss-covered terrain as he advanced deeper into the unknown. The Galactic Exploration Alliance, GEA, had sent him to survey this world, drawn by anomalous energy readings that suggested advanced technology, possibly remnants of an ancient civilization. But so far, all he had found was an unrelenting wilderness, teeming with vibrant flora that seemed almost sentient. Until now. His scanner chirped, its display flickering erratically as it picked up something ahead, a faint energy signature, fluctuating in a way that didn't align with any natural phenomenon. Kieran adjusted his grip on his pulse rifle, instinct honed by years of training urging caution. The signal was weak, almost as if whoever, or whatever, generated it, was barely clinging to existence. Pushing aside a tangle of phosphorescent vines, he stepped into a small clearing and stopped dead in his tracks. At the base of a massive tree with luminescent bark, a woman lay curled against the gnarled roots, barely conscious. Her body was draped in what looked like remnants of some sort of organic material, tattered and worn, offering little in the way of protection. Strands of silver-blue hair cascaded over her shoulders, a stark contrast against her pale skin, which shimmered faintly under the alien moonlight. But it was her eyes that froze him in place, half open, glowing with an ethereal silver hue, flickering between awareness and exhaustion. She wasn't human. Kieran's breath hitched as his mind raced through possibilities. This planet had shown no evidence of intelligent life, at least none that the GEA had detected. Yet here she was, alone, vulnerable, and unmistakably not of this world. His instincts warred between caution and concern. He had encountered alien species before, but there was something different about her. The air around her seemed charged, humming with a low-frequency energy that made the hairs on his arms rise beneath his suit. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Slowly, Kieran took a careful step forward, lowering his rifle just enough to show he wasn't a threat. "Can you hear me?" His voice was steady but gentle, cutting through the silence. The woman stirred, her breath uneven as she tried to lift her head. Panic flickered across her delicate features as her gaze met his, and in an instant, fear took hold. She scrambled backward, her weakened limbs barely supporting her as she pressed herself against the massive tree trunk. "No, no, stay away," she rasped, her voice raw, laced with an accent he couldn't place. Kieran lifted a hand, palm outward, in a universal gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you," he assured her. "I'm with the Galactic Exploration Alliance. You're safe." She didn't seem convinced. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her fingers clutching at the ground as if trying to anchor herself. He could see the tremors in her arms, the barely contained terror in her luminescent gaze. She looked like a trapped animal, wounded and desperate, unsure if she should fight or flee. "What's your name?" he tried again, keeping his voice low, measured. She hesitated, her expression flickering between distrust and something else, something fragile. Her lips parted, but for a moment, no sound came. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Zephyra." Kieran exhaled, relief washing over him. A name. It was something, a tether to reality. "Okay, Zephyra," he said carefully, kneeling to her level but keeping his distance. "Do you know where you are?" Her brow furrowed slightly, as if the question itself was foreign to her. She glanced around, scanning the jungle with wide, unfocused eyes. "No." Her fingers dug into the moss beneath her, her shoulders tensing as if she were trying to hold onto a memory that was slipping through her grasp. I don't remember." Kieran's stomach twisted. Amnesia. It wasn't unheard of after extreme trauma. But the real question was, what had happened to her? Do you remember how you got here? Zephyra flinched at the question. A flash of something. Pain. Horror. Crossing her face before it vanished just as quickly. She shook her head. I just woke up here. Everything else is gone. Gone. The word lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Kieran didn't press further. Not yet. She was barely holding herself together, and forcing memories to surface might do more harm than good. All right, he said finally. We'll figure it out later. Right now, we need to get you someplace safe. Zephyra's gaze snapped back to his, uncertainty flickering in her silver eyes. Safe? Yes, Kieran nodded. My base camp isn't far from here. I have medical supplies, food, shelter. You can rest there. She hesitated, glancing down at herself as if realizing for the first time just how exposed she was. Her clothes were barely intact, her body covered in faint bruises and dirt. The fear in her expression deepened, but beneath it, Kieran saw something else. A quiet plea. A desperate need to trust someone. Anyone. But trust didn't come easily. Not when fear had been all she'd known. Still, she had no other choice. After a long, tense moment, Zephyra swallowed hard and gave the smallest nod. Okay, she whispered. Kieran extended his hand, palm up. He didn't move closer, didn't force her. The decision had to be hers. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at it. Then, slowly, cautiously, her fingers brushed against his. The moment their skin connected, a faint electric pulse jolted through him. Like a static charge, brief but undeniable. Zephyra flinched at the sensation, her eyes widening in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Neither did he. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a silent understanding, a fragile connection in a world that had abandoned her. Kieran tightened his grip just enough to steady her. Let's get out of here, he murmured. As they began their careful journey through the bioluminescent jungle, Kieran couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to Zephyra, whatever secrets her past held, this was only the beginning. And somehow, against all logic, he knew his life would never be the same again. The journey back to Kieran's base was slow, not just because Zephyra was weak, but because every step seemed like a battle within herself. She moved carefully, her bare feet hesitant on the uneven terrain. And though she followed him, he could sense the tension in her body. She was wary, guarded, as if expecting him to turn into something else, something dangerous, at any moment. The jungle around them pulsed with life, strange bioluminescent plants shifting as if aware of their presence. But neither spoke much as they navigated through the darkness. When the small structure of Kieran's temporary outpost came into view, Zephyra's steps faltered. It wasn't much. Just a reinforced shelter with basic survival equipment, a communication panel, and enough supplies to last for a few weeks. But to her, it must have looked foreign, unsettling. Kieran glanced back at her, noting the way her silver eyes darted across the metal exterior. The air around her still carried that subtle hum of energy, though she seemed unaware of it. He had no idea what she was capable of. But right now, she wasn't a threat, just lost. He stepped forward and triggered the door release, the panel beeping softly as the reinforced door slid open. Warm light spilled out, casting his silhouette against the dense jungle behind him. Zephyra remained frozen at the threshold, her gaze flickering between him and the illuminated space beyond. For a moment, Kieran thought she might run. It's safe, he said, keeping his voice calm. No one else is here. She hesitated for another long second before stepping inside. The door slid shut behind her with a quiet hiss, sealing them away from the jungle's eerie glow. Zephyra took a single step forward before stopping, her arms crossing over herself, as if she had just walked into a place she didn't belong. Her silver-blue hair fell in front of her face as she studied the unfamiliar environment. Kieran moved toward a storage compartment, pulling out a clean thermal jacket and an extra set of gear. He turned back to find her standing stiffly in the middle of the room, staring at nothing in particular. He extended the jacket toward her. Here, he said. It's not much, but it should help. She flinched slightly at the offer, her gaze shifting between him and the fabric in his hands. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out, fingers brushing against the material, as if testing whether it was real. She took it, but didn't put it on right away. Instead, she studied it, running her fingers along the seams like someone encountering clothing for the first time. Kieran didn't press her. He turned away, giving her space as he activated the base's environmental controls, adjusting the temperature to something more comfortable. When he turned back, she had wrapped the jacket around herself, pulling it tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her together. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She blinked at him, as if the concept of hunger itself was foreign. For a moment, she seemed to consider the question before shaking her head. "Thirsty?" Another pause. Then, finally, a nod. Kieran retrieved a water container and handed it to her. She accepted it but didn't drink immediately. Instead, she turned it in her hands, watching the liquid shift inside as if mesmerized. Then, with slow deliberation, she lifted it to her lips and took a small sip. It was such a simple action, but something about the way she did it made Kieran's chest tighten. How long had she been alone? How long had she been without something as basic as food and water? She set the container down, her hands tightening around her sleeves. Then, without warning, she turned toward a reflective panel on the wall. Her breath hitched. Kieran followed her gaze. Zephyra was staring at her reflection, frozen, her silver eyes wide with something between fascination and fear. She lifted a hand slowly, fingertips grazing her cheek, then her jaw, then the edge of her hair. Her expression shifted. Bewildered. Hollow. Like she didn't recognize the person staring back at her. Her fingers trembled as they curled into a fist, her gaze locked onto her own image. Kieran remained still, giving her time to process whatever realization was sinking in. After a long moment, she turned to him. "I don't..." Her voice was barely audible. "I don't remember this face." Kieran's stomach tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing her say it made it feel heavier. "Memory loss?" he asked carefully. She nodded. "There are pieces. But everything else?" She exhaled shakily, as if saying the words made them more real. "It's like I don't exist." "You exist," Kieran said without hesitation. "You're here." She searched his face, as if trying to gauge whether he really believed that. Kieran leaned against the edge of the control console, studying her carefully. "We'll figure it out," he told her, bit by bit. She looked away, fingers tightening around the sleeves of the jacket he had given her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. It was a fair question. He had barely known her for an hour, and yet he had already risked leading her back to his base, already treated her like something more than just a stray anomaly on an alien world. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not the kind of person who leaves someone out there alone." She said nothing, but something in her gaze shifted. Something almost imperceptible, like a wall that had been firmly in place had cracked just slightly. The hours that followed were quiet. Zephyra spoke little, but Kieran noticed the way she moved, how she reacted to everything around her. There was hesitation in every action, as if she expected something to go wrong. Yet, despite her fear, she stayed. Kieran spent most of the time running scans, trying to identify anything unusual about her physiology. The results were complicated. Her cellular structure was unlike anything he had seen, enhanced, modified at a level beyond human technology. It was as if someone had meticulously crafted her down to the smallest detail. A synthetic being? No, that wasn't quite right. There was something deeply human about her. A creation. A test subject. Zephyra was watching him again, her silver gaze unblinking. "You've seen something," she said, voice unreadable. Kieran hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Your DNA. It's different." She exhaled softly, closing her eyes. "I know." Kieran straightened. "You remember?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. But I know I'm not normal." There was no emotion in her voice when she said it. No anger, no sadness, just fact. Kieran leaned forward slightly. Do you remember anything about who made you this way? She was quiet for a long time. Then, almost too softly to hear, she said, The Dominion. The word sent a chill down Kieran's spine. She glanced at him, watching his reaction, gauging what he knew. He knew enough. The Dominion was no myth. It was whispered about in military briefings, in classified reports, an empire built on technological superiority, one that saw biology as something to be perfected, reshaped. If Zephyra was tied to them, then she wasn't just a lost traveler. She was something else entirely, and that meant they would come looking for her. Kieran met her gaze, steady and unwavering. We'll figure it out, he repeated. This time, she didn't look away. And for the first time since he found her, she nodded. A distant tremor rippled through the atmosphere, faint, but undeniable. Kieran felt it before he heard it. A subtle shift in pressure, an unnatural hum vibrating through the air like the warning growl of a predator. The jungle around them reacted, glowing flora pulsing erratically as if disturbed by something far beyond human perception. Then, the sky split open. Through the thick canopy, a shadow loomed, massive, sleek, and unmistakably alien. The enormous vessel, dark and faceless, hovered with a silent menace, its presence drowning out the natural sounds of the jungle. Kieran's heart pounded as his mind processed what he was seeing. No civilian ship would enter restricted space like this. No friendly faction would descend upon an uncharted world in absolute silence. They had found her. A sharp gasp from behind him made his stomach tighten. He turned just in time to see Zephyra stumble backward, her silver eyes wide with recognition, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She wasn't just afraid. She was unraveling. She clutched at her temples, her body trembling. Memories, broken and jagged, flooded through her. Cold, sterile walls. Figures in metallic suits, faceless, emotionless. The sensation of something being ripped from her mind, over and over again. The feeling of helplessness. The pain. Her knees buckled, and Kieran was there before she hit the ground, gripping her shoulders. Zephyra, stay with me, he urged. What do you see? Her fingers dug into his arms, her breathing shallow. They're here, she whispered. The Dominion. They're here for me. The words had barely left her lips when a mechanical hiss cut through the air. Kieran twisted toward the sound, instinct driving his body before his mind caught up. From the treetops, figures descended, moving with the fluid precision of creatures designed for nothing but the hunt. The Dreadwardens. They landed without a sound, their silver armor reflecting the eerie glow of the jungle. No unnecessary movement, no hesitation. Their glowing visors locked onto Zephyra like she was nothing more than a target on a screen. Kieran had heard of them. Perfect soldiers, stripped of weakness, devoid of fear. Unstoppable. Zephyra's breathing grew erratic. No, I can't. A single clipped command crackled through the static of the ship's communication relay. Subject identified. Engage. The first shot came fast, too fast. Kieran barely had time to react before he shoved Zephyra behind him, raising his weapon. The blast struck his shoulder plating, the force enough to send him staggering, but he gritted his teeth and fired back. His pulse rifle's energy rounds cut through the air, but the Dreadwardens barely slowed. Kieran cursed under his breath. These weren't just soldiers. They were engineered to anticipate, adapt, to strike with mathematical precision. Every move calculated, every hesitation accounted for. Fighting them was like fighting death itself. A second shot ripped past him, searing into the control panel behind them, sending sparks cascading through the room. The heat flared against his skin, but he didn't waver. He reached for Zephyra, pulling her up. We have to move! But she wasn't moving. Her body was rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. Energy crackled around her, static charging the air. She wasn't just panicking, she was changing. Another memory slammed into her, hands restraining her, voices cold, clinical, the sting of metal pressing against her skin. She's unstable, one voice had said. If the enhancements continue, she will become uncontrollable. The pain. The unbearable, burning pain as something inside her was suppressed. Buried. Now it was rising. Her breathing hitched, her eyes snapping open. No longer just silver but glowing, burning with an intensity Kieran had never seen before. The ground beneath her cracked, and the Dreadwardens hesitated. The air shifted, thickening with raw, pulsing power. Kieran barely had time to react before a blast of energy exploded outward, tearing through the space between them and their attackers. The impact sent the Dreadwardens flying, slamming into the surrounding trees with bone-crushing force. The jungle itself seemed to recoil from the sheer magnitude of it. The storm settled, and in the eerie silence that followed, Kieran turned back to her. Zephyra stood there, her entire form illuminated in a shimmering glow, her hands trembling, fingers curled as if they still held onto the remnants of the force she had just unleashed. She was breathing hard, her gaze flickering between the unconscious soldiers and her own hands. "I didn't mean to—" Her voice broke. She stumbled, her entire body shaking. Kieran was there in an instant, catching her before she collapsed. Her skin was hot beneath his fingers, pulsing with residual energy. She was terrified, not of them, of herself. He could feel the tension in her muscles, the way her entire body was coiled with fear. "I can't control it," she whispered. "It's too much. It's—" "Stop," Kieran said firmly, gripping her tighter. "Listen to me." She shuddered, her breath uneven. "I don't care what they did to you," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I don't care what they made you for. You are not them." Her glowing gaze locked onto his. "I don't care what's inside you," he continued, softer this time. "I care about you. Here. Now." Zephyra swallowed hard, searching his face. "You should be afraid of me." Kieran exhaled, brushing his thumb against her wrist, grounding her. "I'm not." The jungle was quiet, the glow of her energy still shimmering around them. For the first time, the fear in her expression flickered, not gone, but no longer all-consuming. A sharp sound echoed from the trees. One of the Dreadwardens stirred. Kieran tightened his hold on her. "We need to move." Zephyra's hands curled into fists, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was resolve. They ran. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that only came after destruction. The jungle still carried the scars of what had happened. The fractured ground, the trees bent at unnatural angles, the lingering charge of energy that Zephyra had unleashed without meaning to. They had escaped the Dreadwardens, but the truth still followed them, clinging to the air like the ghost of something inevitable. Kieran guided her through the dense foliage, careful not to push too hard. She hadn't spoken much since they fled, and he hadn't pressed. He could see it in her eyes, the weight of something she was beginning to understand, but didn't want to face. They reached a clearing where a small, abandoned outpost stood, one of the many temporary research stations left behind by early explorers. It was barely functional, but it provided shelter, a place to think. Zephyra sat on the metal bench inside, her silver-blue hair still faintly illuminated from the residual energy that pulsed beneath her skin. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers curled slightly as if she wasn't sure what to do with them. Kieran knelt in front of her, waiting. Finally, she spoke. "I remember now," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Who I am. What I was made for." Kieran didn't move, letting her find her own way through the words. "They called me a Celestian," she continued. "A creation, a living weapon." She exhaled shakily. "I was designed to conquer worlds, to lead their armies into battle. Not as a soldier, but as something more. Something unstoppable." She stared at her hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "But I was a failure to them." Kieran frowned. "Why?" Her fingers tightened, her breathing shallow. "Because I started to think, to feel." She looked up at him, and in the dim light, her silver eyes were full of something raw and unguarded. "They engineered me to be perfect, but emotions weren't part of the design. They thought they had control over every part of me, until they didn't. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. I wasn't supposed to question. I wasn't supposed to hesitate. But I did. And when they realized I was broken... Her voice caught for a moment before she forced it out. They discarded me. Just left me behind. Kieran sat back slightly, his jaw tightening. He had seen a lot in his years as a scout. But this was different. He had been trained to view things logically, to assess threats, to categorize everything he encountered into known and unknown dangers. But Zephyra didn't fit into any of those boxes. She was something else entirely. And yet, sitting here now, stripped of all the expectations that had been forced upon her, she looked nothing like a weapon. You weren't a failure, he said, after a long pause. You were a miracle. She blinked at him, startled. They tried to create something inhuman, something controllable, he continued, his voice steady. And instead, they made someone who could think for herself. Zephyra let out a breath, but it was shaky, uncertain. What if I am what they say? She asked. What if deep down I really am a weapon? Kieran held her gaze. That's not for them to decide. And it's not something written in your DNA. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her jacket. I don't know how to be anything else. Kieran reached out, brushing his knuckles lightly against her wrist. It was a small gesture, barely there, but she felt it. A grounding presence, something warm against the storm inside her. They created you, he said. But they don't own you. His voice was firm, unwavering. They built your body, Zephyra, but you built your mind, your heart. That's what makes you different. She swallowed hard. And if I can't control it, then we figure it out, he said simply. Together. She searched his face for any trace of doubt, any flicker of fear. But there was none. He meant it. For the first time since she had remembered what she was, the weight in her chest eased just slightly. Maybe she wasn't just something made to destroy. Maybe she could choose something else. Maybe, for the first time, she could be more than what they had intended. The sky above Nix 7 had begun to darken, the faint hum of the planet's distant orbit now disturbed by a much louder, more insistent sound. It started as a faint rumble, but it grew steadily, like the distant thunder before a storm, until the ground beneath Kieran's feet seemed to tremble with anticipation. The tension was palpable, thickening the air around them. He turned to look at Zephyra, who stood motionless beside him, her silver eyes wide with realization. She had known it was only a matter of time. The Dominion had tracked them down. The overwhelming presence of their warships in orbit was an undeniable signal. They would not let her go. They would not let her escape the fate they had designed for her. They had created her, shaped her. And now they were coming to reclaim her, to erase the very humanity that had begun to bloom within her. They had always seen her as a weapon, a tool of conquest. Nothing more. And now they would finish what they had started. They're here, Zephyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the low rumble of the approaching fleet. Her face had lost its color, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the fabric of her jacket. For a moment, it seemed as if she might collapse under the weight of what was about to happen. Kieran stood taller, his resolve hardening. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had haunted her from the moment they met. But now, something else was there too. A flicker of defiance. He stepped closer to her, his voice steady. We don't run from this. We face it. Together. Her gaze flickered to his, searching his face for any trace of doubt. But there was none. He meant it. He had always meant it. We won't let them take you, he said firmly. We'll fight, not to destroy, but to free you. To give you the life they tried to take away. Zephyra looked down at the ground, her fingers curling into fists. She had lived in fear of herself, of the power the Dominion had forced upon her. But Kieran's words felt like a lifeline. Maybe she didn't have to be their weapon. Maybe, just maybe, she could be something more. She could be free. They didn't have much time. Kieran checked the perimeter of their makeshift camp, his mind working quickly to assess the situation. The Dominion wasn't just sending a single ship. They had sent an entire fleet. And at its forefront, the Dreadwardens, their elite soldiers, would be descending to claim their prize. They were relentless, emotionless, and built for one purpose: to hunt and capture. Zephyra felt the power within her, still volatile and untamed, swirling beneath her skin like a storm ready to break. She was no longer just the creation of the Dominion. She was more than that now. She had learned to feel, to care, to fight for something greater than herself. But the energy inside her was still a constant source of fear. What if she lost control? What if she hurt Kieran? "Are you ready?" Kieran asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Zephyra took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I have to be." They made their way toward the clearing, the sky now fully darkened, the only light coming from the distant glow of the Dominion fleet. The Dreadwardens would land soon, and when they did, the fight for Zephyra's freedom would begin. The first wave of soldiers descended from the sky, their heavily armored bodies encased in reflective, crystalline suits. They moved with the precision of machines, each step calculated, each movement predictable. They were made to be perfect. Perfect hunters. Perfect killers. Kieran raised his weapon, aiming at the approaching soldiers, his pulse rifle ready. He fired, the energy blasts striking the first wave of Dreadwardens. But they didn't flinch. They didn't even slow down. He cursed under his breath. They were too many. He needed to buy Zephyra time to figure out how to use her power, how to control it. He needed to keep them away from her. But the Dreadwardens were relentless. They closed in quickly, their weapons drawn. Kieran's shots were starting to miss. The pressure was mounting. "Get down!" Kieran shouted as one of the Dreadwardens fired an energy blast directly at him. The force of the blast hit his chest, sending him flying backward into a pile of debris. He groaned, his vision blurring for a moment, but he quickly regained his focus. His armor had absorbed most of the impact, but it wasn't enough to keep him from being stunned. Zephyra's breath caught in her throat. She saw Kieran on the ground, struggling to get back up. Something inside her snapped. She couldn't let him die. Not like this. With a sharp intake of breath, she closed her eyes, focusing on the energy that still surged through her. She could feel it, the raw power that the Dominion had implanted in her. But now, it was hers to control, not theirs. She reached for it, trying to harness it, trying to focus it into something she could use. It came to her in an instant, a blast of energy, pure and unrefined, shot from her hands like a tidal wave, crashing into the Dreadwardens with overwhelming force. The soldiers were knocked back, their crystalline armor shattering under the intensity of her power. Zephyra stood there, breathing heavily, her body glowing with a radiant light as she let the energy flow through her, becoming part of her. The Dreadwardens faltered, confusion flashing behind their visor-like helmets. They had never encountered anything like this before. They had never been faced with a weapon that could turn the tide against them. Kieran pushed himself up, his heart racing as he watched Zephyra. She was no longer the weapon the Dominion had created. She was something different, something unstoppable. He moved quickly, firing on the remaining soldiers as they tried to regroup. The Dreadwardens were no longer the perfect hunters they once were. They couldn't predict the chaos that Zephyra unleashed. One by one, the soldiers fell, their once immovable forms shattered by her power. The Dreadwardens, who had been trained to be flawless, couldn't handle the unpredictable force of emotion and freedom that Zephyra had embraced. She was no longer their creation. She was her own. As the last of the Dreadwardens fell, silence descended upon the battlefield. Kieran looked at Zephyra, his heart swelling with admiration. She had done it. She had broken their chains. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, though her eyes still shone with the aftermath of the battle. "I'm more than all right," she said softly. "I'm free." And for the first time, she truly was. As the smoke of the battle still lingered in the air, and the distant rumble of retreating ships echoed through the jungle, Zephyra stood in the heart of the clearing, her chest heaving with the aftermath of the intense fight. The Dominion fleet had pulled back, but their defeat was a bitter one for them. They had underestimated what she had become. They had created her to be a weapon, to be used without question. But they hadn't anticipated the force she would unleash when she chose to break free of their control. Now, the only thing left in the wake of the Dominion's departure was the haunting knowledge that they would never forget the betrayal. The organization that had spent so much time and effort crafting her, shaping her into something they could use, had underestimated her power, the power of choice, of freedom. And in that power, Zephyra had done the unthinkable. She had destroyed their hold over her, shattered the very foundation they had built her on. They would come back. They would seek retribution. But for now, they had been forced to retreat, unable to contain the force they had unleashed. Kieran approached her slowly, his movements careful, as if testing the air around them. He could see the change in her, the way she stood, not as a victim of the past, but as someone who had just taken her first step into something entirely new. She wasn't the same person she had been when they first met. She wasn't a tool, a weapon, or even a Celestian anymore. She was Zephyra, a person who had made a choice to forge her own path, no longer bound by the expectations of others. "Are you ready?" Kieran asked, his voice low but steady. They had been through so much together, so much pain, so many close calls. But this moment, this question, was different. This was the beginning of something neither of them could fully comprehend yet. Zephyra turned to him, her eyes filled with something that had never been there before. Hope. It was raw, unguarded, and beautiful in its simplicity. For the first time in her life, she wasn't defined by the cruelty of those who had created her. She wasn't defined by what they had made her to be. She was free. "I am," she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of what it meant. "I'm ready." For the first time in her life, Zephyra felt as though she had been seen for who she truly was. Not a weapon, not an experiment. Just herself. And that, in itself, was something so foreign, yet so incredibly beautiful. The feeling of being loved, just for being, was something she had never known. The Dominion had always shaped her for a purpose, stripped her of her humanity, leaving nothing but the cold logic of their designs. But Kieran had seen beyond that. He had seen her, not as something to be controlled, but as someone who could choose her own future. Kieran stepped closer, and as he did, Zephyra felt the unspoken tension between them. Their eyes met, the air thick with emotion. The connection they had shared, forged in the fires of battle, had evolved into something deeper, something neither of them had expected, but something neither could deny. "Zephyra," Kieran whispered, his voice hushed but filled with conviction. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The weight of his words settled over her like a warm, comforting blanket. She had never known such tenderness, such certainty. It was everything she had longed for, but had never dared to believe she deserved. She reached out, her hand trembling as it rested against his chest. His heartbeat was steady, strong, so alive, so human. She could feel it resonating in her own chest, a rhythm that matched her own pulse. She wasn't a machine anymore. She wasn't a thing to be discarded. She was human. Without thinking, she pulled him closer. Their lips met in a kiss that wasn't desperate, wasn't about fear or survival. It was about something more. It was about a connection that transcended their pasts, a connection that bridged the gap between who they had been and who they could become. For Zephyra, it was a revelation. It was freedom in its purest form. The freedom to love, to choose, to live. In that single moment, she realized that her entire life had been leading her to this choice, to this love. She wasn't a weapon anymore. She was a person with a future. And in Kieran's arms, she felt it for the first time. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something much more precious, for the chance to truly live. Kieran, too, felt the magnitude of the moment. He had always thought of himself as a soldier, trained to fight, to protect, to survive. But in Zephyra's eyes, he saw something that made him question everything he had ever known. She had been made to destroy, but she had chosen love. She had chosen life. And now, that choice was their shared path. "We have a long road ahead of us," Kieran murmured as he pulled away slightly, his forehead resting gently against hers. Zephyra smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes, filling them with a light that had been absent for so long. "I know. But for the first time, I'm not afraid." They stood together in the quiet aftermath, the storm of their pasts now behind them. The Dominion might still be out there, still planning their next move, but Zephyra and Kieran no longer had to fear what they couldn't control. They had each other. And that, for the first time in Zephyra's life, was enough. As the first rays of dawn began to break across the horizon, painting the sky with hues of violet and gold, they turned toward the distant hills, where a new journey awaited them. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for Zephyra, it was hers to make. The road would be long, and the past would always linger in the background, but it no longer defined her. She was free now, truly free, and that was all that mattered. Together, Kieran and Zephyra walked into the unknown, not as enemies of the past or as creations of others' wills, but as two souls united in their choice to embrace their future. And for the first time, Zephyra knew she was ready to face whatever came next. The world around them was quiet now, but the distant hum of the Dominion fleet still loomed over Nix 7, like a shadow that would never fully recede. Despite their victory, the truth was clear. The Dominion had not given up. Their grip on Zephyra, their belief that she was a tool to be controlled, would not be loosened so easily. They would be back, and they would come with more force, more determination. But this time, things were different. Zephyra and Kieran stood together, stronger than they had ever been, no longer victims of the past. Zephyra had shed the chains that had bound her, the expectations placed upon her by the Dominion, and for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be free. No longer a weapon, no longer a mere creation. She was a person, and she was not afraid to fight for what she had found. Beside her, Kieran had been more than just a companion. He had become her partner, her equal in this new world they were forging. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was someone who saw her for who she was and fought alongside her because he believed in her. Together, they were no longer two strangers caught in a battle for survival. They were a team. They had no illusions about what lay ahead. The Dominion would never simply let go of their prize. But Zephyra and Kieran no longer needed to hide or run. They had fought for their freedom, and now they would fight for their future. Their purpose wasn't defined by the demands of an empire that sought to control them, but by their own choices. They had chosen to live for themselves, to love without fear, and to embrace a future that was theirs to shape. With each step they took, they moved further away from the shadows of their past and into a new dawn. The road ahead would not be easy. It would be filled with challenges, with dangers they couldn't yet fully understand. The Dominion would not stop, and there would be more battles to fight. But for the first time, Zephyra felt the weight of her own power, not as something that controlled her, but as something she could control. She was no longer the Celestian they had created. She was Zephyra, a woman with a destiny of her own making. Kieran didn't need to say anything to her as they walked. He didn't need to reassure her or remind her of the path they had chosen. They both understood that this was their journey now. No longer would they be pawns in the Dominion's game. They would live for themselves, fight for their freedom, and most importantly, love without apology. As they left the remnants of the battle behind them, the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, casting the jungle in a golden light. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and vast. But for the first time, Zephyra felt ready to face it, knowing that no matter what happened, she would no longer be alone. They were together, stronger than ever. And nothing, not even the Dominion, could take that away. With a shared glance, they stepped forward into the unknown, not running from the darkness, but embracing the light they had fought so hard to find. This was just the beginning of their journey, and no matter what came next, they were ready. Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here, Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.